Imagine a general who never lost a single battle in over 6 decades of warfare. Not one. A commander who fought across a stretch of land so vast it would take you months to cross it by car today. A man who, with no satellites, no radio, no maps as we understand them, coordinated armies separated by hundreds of miles with a precision that military historians still struggle to fully explain. Now imagine that almost nobody outside of serious history circles knows his name. The year is 1241. 2 armies are marching into the heart of Europe simultaneously. One into Poland, one into Hungary, separated by an entire mountain range. They will strike within 2 days of each other. This is not a coincidence, this is a plan. And the mind behind it belongs to a man born into slavery on the Mongolian steppe, who would go on to become arguably the greatest military commander the world has ever seen. How does a man from the edge of the known world come to outthink every king, duke, and military commander Europe has to offer? What was it about Subutai that made him so uniquely, almost impossibly dangerous? And why, at the very moment Europe lay completely open before him, did the Mongol army simply turn around and go home? Those questions are at the heart of this story, and by the end, you will have answers that might genuinely surprise you. Before we go further, if you enjoy history told this way, with the full story, the real complexity, and none of the filler, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos, and it takes about 2 seconds. Now, let us get into it. To understand Subutai, you first have to understand the world that made him. And to understand that world, you have to forget almost everything you think you know about the Mongols. The popular image of the Mongols is one of pure destruction, a horde of horsemen burning cities and leaving nothing behind. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors was not simply a force of chaos. It was one of the most sophisticated military and administrative machines the medieval world ever produced. It created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It connected trade routes from China to the Mediterranean. It moved information across continents faster than any civilization before it. And at the center of its military genius, for nearly half a century, was one man. Subutai, sometimes spelled Subutai or Subotai, was born around 1175 on the Mongolian steppe, likely into a clan of blacksmiths called the Uryankai. This is significant. He was not born into the warrior aristocracy. He had no noble lineage, no inherited command, no political connections. What he had was ability, and the fortune to attach himself early to a young leader named Temujin, the man the world would later know as Genghis Khan. Here is where a popular myth deserves to be challenged directly. Many accounts portray the Mongol military success as primarily a product of Genghis Khan's personal genius, with his generals serving as loyal but interchangeable executors of his will. The historical record tells a more complicated story. Genghis Khan was undoubtedly a transformative leader, a unifier of the steppe tribes, and a strategic visionary. But he also had the rare wisdom to identify and empower subordinates who were, in specific areas, more gifted than he was. Subutai was the clearest example of this. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1027, Subutai had already been the primary architect of some of the empire's most complex campaigns. He was not just a loyal sword, he was the brain of the Mongol war machine. So how did Subutai actually think? What made him different? The first thing to understand is that Subutai did not approach warfare the way his contemporaries did. In medieval Europe and across much of Asia, battles were understood as direct confrontations, 2 forces meeting on a field, with the stronger or braver side winning. Strategy existed, certainly, but it was largely understood in terms of siegecraft, fortification, and the management of supply lines. The idea of warfare as a system, as a complex, multi-layered problem requiring intelligence gathering, psychological manipulation, deception, and the coordination of forces across vast distances, this was not how most commanders thought. Subutai thought exactly this way, and he had been thinking this way since he was a young man. His first major independent command came around 1205, when he was still in his late 20s. But the campaign that first revealed the full scope of his abilities came in 1221, and it is one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in recorded history. After the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Islamic sultanate covering modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, Genghis Khan sent Subutai and a general named Jebe on what was essentially a reconnaissance in force. Their mission: circle around the Caspian Sea, gather intelligence, and return. What actually happened was something far more dramatic. With a force estimated at around 20,000 cavalry, Subutai and Jebe rode through Persia, into the Caucasus, defeated the Kingdom of Georgia, crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, which was considered essentially impossible, defeated the Cumans and Alans on the Pontic steppe, and then, in 1223, met a combined force of Cuman and Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River. This is one of the wow moments of this entire story, so pay attention. The Mongols had been retreating. The Rus and Cuman forces, around 80,000 strong according to some estimates, though historians debate the exact figures, pursued them, believing they were winning. It was a feint, a deliberate, calculated withdrawal designed to string out the pursuing army, break their formation, and draw them onto ground of Subutai's choosing. When the Mongols turned and attacked, the result was catastrophic for the Rus forces. Several princes were captured, and in a detail that is both grim and revealing of Mongol psychology, the Mongol commanders executed them without spilling royal blood. They placed the princes under wooden boards and sat on them during their victory feast. It was a statement as much as an execution. Then, having demonstrated what they could do, Subutai and Jebe simply rode away. Their mission was reconnaissance, and they had gathered everything they needed to know. They returned to Genghis Khan, having traveled roughly 5,000 miles in 3 years, and having fought and won major engagements the entire way. No other military force in the medieval world could have done this. It was not just the riding, it was the logistics, the discipline, the intelligence networks, and the command flexibility that made it possible. But this was only the beginning. Genghis Khan died in 1227, and the empire passed to his son Ogedei. Subutai continued to serve, and under Ogedei, he was given command of the campaign that would define his legacy, the invasion of Europe. To understand why Europe was so catastrophically unprepared for what was coming, you need to understand what Europe looked like in the 1230s. It was not a unified political entity. It was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with their own armies, their own interests, and their own deeply ingrained suspicions of their neighbors. The Holy Roman Empire, which, as the old saying goes, was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire in any unified sense, was locked in a bitter political struggle with the papacy. The kingdoms of Poland and Hungary were independently powerful, but had no tradition of coordinated military response to external threats. The Teutonic Knights and other crusading orders were primarily focused on campaigns in the Baltic and the Holy Land. In short, Europe was divided, distracted, and dangerously overconfident. Meanwhile, Subutai had spent years preparing for the European campaign in a way that no medieval European commander would have recognized as preparation. He sent spies, merchants, travelers, diplomats into Russia, Poland, and Hungary years before the first Mongol soldier crossed the Volga. He accumulated intelligence on roads, river crossings, political relationships between rulers, the strengths and weaknesses of local armies, the locations of food stores. He understood the terrain of a continent he had never visited better than most of its own rulers understood it. Here is the second wow fact, and it is a striking one. Subutai is believed to have planned the European campaign for roughly a decade before it was launched. The Mongol invasion of Europe in 1241 was not an opportunistic raid. It was the result of meticulous, long-term strategic planning on a scale that had no parallel in the medieval world. The campaign began in earnest in 1237 when Subutai led the Mongol forces into the Rus principalities, the collection of city-states that occupied modern-day Russia and Ukraine. One by one, the great cities fell. Vladimir, Suzdal, Ryazan, Tver. Moscow, then a relatively minor town, was burned. In 1240, Kiev, one of the most magnificent cities in the medieval world, a city of perhaps 50,000 people, was sacked. A papal envoy who passed through the region a few years later described seeing bones and skulls covering the fields for miles in every direction. The destruction of the Rus principalities was not simply a military campaign. It was also a strategic preparation. By eliminating the buffer states between the Mongol heartland and Western Europe, Subutai removed any possibility of a warning system or a coordinated defense. When the Mongols finally turned west toward Poland and Hungary in early 1211, they came without warning, and they came from multiple directions at once. This is where Subutai's genius becomes almost difficult to believe. He divided his forces into 3 separate armies. One, under a prince named Kaidu, moved north through Poland. A central force under Batu Khan, the nominal commander of the entire Western campaign, though Subutai was its operational mind, drove through the Carpathian passes into Hungary. A third force moved south to seal off any escape routes through Transylvania. The Northern Army's purpose was not primarily conquest. It was distraction and prevention. By driving into Poland, Subutai ensured that the Polish and German forces, who might otherwise have reinforced Hungary, would be fully occupied defending their own territory. And it worked with terrible efficiency. On April 9, 1241, the Mongol Northern Force met a combined army of Polish and German knights at the Battle of Legnica. The European force, which included some of the finest heavy cavalry in the world, was destroyed. 2 days later, Subutai's main force met the Hungarian army under King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi on the banks of the Sahol River. The Battle of Mohi is worth examining in some detail, because it is a masterclass in the kind of warfare Subutai had been practicing his entire life. Bela IV had assembled a substantial army. Estimates range from 40,000 to 60,000 men, though these medieval figures should be treated with caution. He had chosen a strong defensive position, with the Sahol River protecting his flank and his army encamped behind a protective barrier of chained wagons. By the military standards of the time, it was a solid defensive setup. Subutai had faced similar formations before. He knew exactly how to break it. The battle began before dawn. A Mongol force attacked the bridge over the Sajo, drawing the Hungarian army's attention and creating the impression that this was the main assault. While the Hungarians rushed to defend the bridge, Subutai personally led a force across the river at a separate crossing point further south. He had reportedly supervised the construction of a temporary bridge overnight, in secret, to make this flanking movement possible. What happened next demonstrated something that separated Subutai from virtually every other commander of his era. When the Mongols had the Hungarian army surrounded and on the verge of complete destruction, they deliberately left an opening in their encirclement, a gap through which the Hungarians could flee. This seems counterintuitive. Why let your enemy escape? Because Subutai understood something that most commanders did not. A surrounded army fights with the desperation of men who have nothing to lose. An army that believes it can escape will run rather than fight. And a running army, strung out across open ground, is far easier to destroy piecemeal than a concentrated force fighting for its survival. The gap was a trap. The Hungarians poured through it, and the Mongol cavalry pursued them for 2 days, cutting down the fleeing soldiers across miles of countryside. King Bela IV escaped, but his army was effectively destroyed. Hungary lay open, and Subutai was not finished. The Mongols swept across Hungary, reaching the Adriatic coast by the spring of 1242. Cities were taken, the countryside was devastated, and Bela IV fled from island to island along the Dalmatian coast, unable to mount any meaningful resistance. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe, issued warnings and proclamations, but sent no meaningful military assistance. The Teutonic Knights prepared defensive positions. The French king and the English king were, at this moment, more concerned with each other than with the catastrophe unfolding in the east. Here is the third wow fact, and perhaps the most haunting of them all. In the spring of 1241, there was effectively no military force between the Mongol army and the Atlantic Ocean capable of stopping them. Europe, as a political and cultural entity, was genuinely at risk of being overrun. And then the Mongols stopped. They did not stop because of military defeat. They did not stop because of European resistance. They stopped because in December 1241, Ogedei Khan, the son of Genghis Khan and the ruler of the Mongol Empire, died in his capital of Karakorum, thousands of miles away. Under Mongol law and custom, the great nobles and generals of the empire were required to return to the capital for the Kurultai, the great assembly where a new Khan would be chosen. Batu Khan, who had political ambitions of his own within the empire's succession, needed to be present, and where Batu Khan went, the army went. Subutai, who was in his mid-60s at this point and had spent his entire adult life in the service of the Mongol Empire, rode east. He would never return to Europe. Historians have debated ever since whether the Mongol withdrawal was truly caused solely by Ogedei's death, or whether other factors, supply difficulties, the approaching summer heat, the fortified cities of Western Europe that would have required prolonged sieges, also played a role. The honest answer is that the historical record does not give us certainty. What we can say is that Ogedei's death provided the immediate trigger, and that the political dynamics of the succession crisis gave the Mongol princes strong personal reasons to abandon the campaign regardless of its military prospects. What is not in doubt is that the withdrawal ended one of the most consequential military campaigns in European history, and that the man who had designed and executed it was one of the most remarkable military minds who ever lived. Subutai continued to serve after the European campaign. He led the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, developing tactics for river warfare and siege operations in a completely different geographical and strategic environment. He was, by this point, elderly by medieval standards, likely in his late 60s. He reportedly had to be carried on a litter because he was too heavy to ride a horse comfortably, a detail that humanizes him in a way that his battlefield reputation does not. He died around 1248, likely in his early 70s, having commanded armies in campaigns spanning modern-day China, Korea, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Persia, Georgia, and beyond. The numbers attached to his career are staggering, though they should be understood as approximations. He is credited with fighting in more than 20 major campaigns and over 65 significant battles across his career. He never suffered a strategic defeat. These figures come from various historical sources and should be treated with appropriate caution. Medieval record-keeping was imperfect, and the Mongol tradition was primarily oral, but even if the numbers are somewhat inflated, the scale of his achievement remains extraordinary. So why does this matter? Why should you, sitting here in the present, care about a Mongolian general who died 8 centuries ago? The answer is not simply that Subutai was impressive, though he was. The answer is what his career reveals about the nature of power, preparation, and strategic thinking. Subutai succeeded not because he was braver than his enemies, or because his soldiers were individually superior fighters. The knights of Poland and Hungary were among the finest warriors in the world by the standards of their time. He succeeded because he operated on a different level of strategic abstraction than anyone he faced. While European commanders were thinking about the next battle, Subutai was thinking about the next decade. While they were managing their own armies, he was managing information, gathering it, analyzing it, and using it to shape engagements before the first arrow was fired. The European campaign of 1241 failed not because of anything the Europeans did, but because of a death on the other side of the world. That is a humbling thought. The survival of medieval European civilization as we know it may have hinged on the health of a man in a city most Europeans had never heard of. There is also something worth noting about how history remembers and forgets people like Subutai. He left no written records of his own. He built no monuments. He founded no dynasty. He was a general in service to an empire, and when that empire's politics moved on, his name moved with it into obscurity. The rulers he defeated, the kings and princes of Europe, left behind chronicles written by monks and courtiers who had every reason to emphasize the miraculous nature of the Mongol withdrawal and every reason to minimize the completeness of the military defeat. History, as always, is written by those who survive to write it. Subutai's legacy lives most clearly not in popular memory, but in military theory. Officers in the 19th and 20th centuries who studied the Mongolian campaigns found in them principles that they recognized from their own most sophisticated military thinking: the importance of intelligence, the use of deception, the coordination of widely separated forces toward a single strategic objective, the psychological dimension of warfare. Some military historians argue that the Mongol campaigns under Subutai represent the first truly modern approach to warfare in terms of strategic conception, even if the technology was entirely pre-modern. The Mongol Empire itself did not survive in the form Subutai served. It fragmented after Ogedei's death, splitting into successor states: the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, each of which eventually dissolved or was absorbed into other political structures. The steppe nomadic way of life that had produced the Mongol military system was gradually marginalized by the spread of gunpowder, settled agriculture, and the fortified city-states of the early modern period. But the consequences of the Mongol campaigns, including Subutai's, shaped the world in ways that are still visible. The destruction of the Rus principalities fundamentally altered the political development of what would become Russia, contributing to centuries of relative isolation from Western European cultural and political trends. The sack of Baghdad in 1258, carried out by Subutai's successors following the strategic template he had helped establish, ended the Abbasid Caliphate and dealt a blow to Islamic intellectual culture from which, some historians argue, the region took centuries to recover. The borders, the political structures, and even the cultural identities of Eastern Europe were shaped in part by the Mongol invasions and the responses they provoked. And at the center of all of it, for nearly 50 years, was a man from a blacksmith clan on the Mongolian steppe who attached himself to the right leader at the right moment, and then spent the rest of his life proving that the greatest weapon in any war is not a sword or a horse or even an army. It is a mind that can hold the entire battlefield and everything beyond it in clear, cold focus. Subutai never lost a battle, but perhaps more importantly, he almost never had to fight one on terms he had not already chosen. That is the real measure of his genius. By the time his enemies understood what was happening, the outcome had already been decided. Weeks, months, sometimes years before the armies ever met. History is full of brilliant generals. It is not full of generals who operated at the scale Subutai operated, across the distances he operated, with the consistency he demonstrated over the length of career he sustained. Whatever combination of intelligence, discipline, psychological insight, and sheer relentless preparation produced him, the world has not seen many like him. And the fact that most people could not name him, that he remains a footnote in popular history while lesser commanders fill the pages of best-selling books, says something worth sitting with. The most effective people are not always the most celebrated. The most consequential events are not always the ones we remember. History rewards the survivors and the storytellers. It does not always reward the truth. Subutai was the truth of the Mongol Empire's military power. He was what it actually looked like when that empire was operating at its highest level. And he deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, but as what he was, one of the most extraordinary military minds in the history of human civilization. What do you think was the decisive factor in Subutai's success? Was it his long-term intelligence gathering and preparation, or was it his ability to adapt and improvise in the heat of battle? Both arguments have real merit, and the answer might tell us something interesting about what genius actually looks like. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely read them, and the discussions there are often as interesting as the videos themselves. If this kind of history, deep, honest, and without the myths, is what you come here for, then subscribing to the channel is the best way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. It keeps this kind of work possible. And speaking of what comes next, in the next video, we are going to look at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. The moment when the Mongol advance was finally stopped, not by a European army, but by a force that fought the Mongols at their own game and won. It is the other side of this story, and it is just as remarkable. We will see you there. Wait, before we close the book entirely on Subutai, there is one dimension of his story that deserves more attention than it typically receives, because so far we have talked about what he did. We have not fully talked about how he thought, and why that thinking was so far ahead of its time that it almost defies the era he lived in. Consider the problem of communication. Today, a general can speak to a subordinate commander on the other side of a mountain range in seconds. In 1241, a message traveled only as fast as a horse could carry it. The Mongol solution to this problem was the Yam system, a network of relay stations spaced roughly 25 miles apart across the entire empire, where fresh horses were always available. A message could travel from one end of the Mongol world to the other in days rather than weeks. This was not just a postal system, it was a strategic nervous system, and Subutai used it to coordinate operations across distances that no other military force of the period could have managed. But the Yam system was infrastructure. What Subutai brought to it was something no infrastructure can provide, the judgment to know what information mattered, what orders to send, and when silence was more useful than communication. There are accounts, admittedly filtered through sources that must be read critically, of Subutai issuing orders to subordinate commanders that anticipated enemy responses several moves ahead, adjusting his dispositions before the enemy had even made the decisions Subutai had already predicted they would make. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate in their details or somewhat embellished by later tradition, the pattern they describe is consistent with everything else we know about how he operated. He also understood something that very few commanders in any era have fully grasped: The relationship between fear and military effectiveness. The Mongols under Subutai were not simply brutal. They were strategically brutal, which is a very different thing. Cities that surrendered without resistance were generally treated with relative leniency, their populations spared, their trade connections preserved. Cities that resisted were destroyed comprehensively, and that destruction was publicized deliberately. Word traveled ahead of the Mongol armies, carried by refugees and merchants, and it shaped the decisions of the next city in their path. Subutai was managing the psychological environment of the campaign as carefully as he managed its logistics. This is why the European campaign of 1241 unfolded so quickly. By the time the Mongols crossed into Poland and Hungary, the reputation of what had happened to the Rus principalities had already arrived. Commanders who might have fought more effectively were paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Populations fled rather than organized. The psychological groundwork had been laid years in advance, just as carefully as the military intelligence had been gathered. There is also the question of what Subutai's campaigns meant for the people who lived through them, not the kings and generals, but the ordinary men, women, and children caught in the path of the Mongol advance. This part of the story is harder to tell with precision, because the sources are fragmentary, often written by survivors with understandable reasons to emphasize the horror of what they witnessed, and sometimes contradictory. What is clear is that the human cost was enormous. Populations were displaced, agricultural systems were disrupted, and entire regions experienced demographic collapses whose effects persisted for generations. It would be a mistake, though, to reduce Subutai's legacy purely to destruction. The Mongol Empire he served also created conditions for one of the most remarkable periods of cross-cultural exchange in medieval history. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace that settled over the empire's vast territories after the initial conquests, allowed merchants, scholars, diplomats, and ideas to travel between China and Europe with a freedom that had not existed before and would not exist again for centuries. The bubonic plague tragically also traveled these routes, reaching Europe in the 1340s along the same trade corridors the Mongols had opened. History rarely offers clean moral ledgers. Subutai himself was not a builder of this peace. He was its violent precondition. The trade routes that flourished under the Pax Mongolica were open partly because he had removed the political obstacles, the competing states, the hostile kingdoms, the fragmented authorities that had previously blocked them. Whether that trade-off was worth the cost is not a question history can answer for us. It is a question each person has to sit with individually. What history can tell us is that Subutai's career represents something genuinely rare. A case where individual human ability, operating within a specific historical context, demonstrably changed the trajectory of events on a continental scale. Remove Subutai from the Mongol campaigns, and it is not clear that the European invasion happens the way it did, or that the Rus principalities fall as completely as they did, or that the Khwarezmian Empire collapses as rapidly as it did. He was not irreplaceable in the way that myths make individuals irreplaceable. The Mongol Empire had other capable generals, and Genghis Khan's organizational genius created a system larger than any one person. But within that system, Subutai occupied a position that no one else filled in quite the same way. He was the empire's reach, the part of it that extended furthest, thought furthest ahead, and operated most effectively at the edge of the known world. And perhaps that is the most fitting epitaph for a man who spent his entire life moving outward, always to the next horizon, always to the next campaign, always to the next problem that no one else had yet thought to solve. The steppe that produced him is still there. The wind still moves across it in the same way it did in the 12th century, but the world that wind touches now is, in ways both visible and invisible, partly the product of what one man from a blacksmith clan chose to do with the life he was given. That is worth knowing. That is worth remembering. What do you think was the decisive factor in Subutai's success? Was it his extraordinary long-term preparation and intelligence gathering, or was it his ability to read a battlefield in real time and adapt faster than any opponent could respond? Both arguments are genuinely compelling, and historians have landed on different sides of this question. Drop your answer in the comments. The conversation there is always worth joining. If deep, honest history without the myths is what brings you here, subscribing to the channel is the single best way to make sure you catch everything we put out. It takes 2 seconds, and it makes a real difference. In the next video, we are going to the other side of this story, the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mongol advance was finally stopped, not by a European army, but by a force that understood Mongol tactics well enough to turn them back. It is one of the most fascinating reversals in military history, and it raises questions about inevitability and contingency that go far beyond the battlefield. We will see you there.